September 17th, 2023. Oregon's Atoria, a city by the sea situated where the Columbia River empties into the Pacific Ocean. A city that has a long history of marine trade, fishing, and canning that shaped the Pacific Northwest economy for more than a century. And a city with historic structures remain along the shoreline, many of which have been deserted for decades and are gradually decaying in the saline air and coastline climate. The gigantic historic Smith Salmon Cannery was one such structure, building made of brick and wood that had been abandoned since the early 1970s when the Pacific Northwest's dwindling fish populations ultimately caused the salmon canning industry to fail. Contemporary rivalry and shifting economics. The deteriorated structure was supported by pilings above the water. Its roof is drooping, its windows are boarded up or damaged, and its wooden exterior is gray with age, in areas that have been neglected for 50 years. In July of 2023, a development firm acquired the land with aspirational goals to transform the historic Cannery into opulent condominiums on the waterfront. It was in a superb location just on the views of the Columbia River and the bridge leading to Washington State. Despite its decay, the structure possessed solid bones. With significant remodeling, it may become desirable real estate in a city where demand for waterfront real estate was rising. Before renovations could start, structural engineers had to examine every part of the structure to determine what could be preserved and what needed to be changed. On September 17th, Stephen Clark, with 25 years of experience in ancient building restoration, the structural engineer was carrying out his examination of the basement floors and storage spaces for canneries. The Cannery was a maze of rooms, hallways, storage spaces, and processing sections dispersed, encompassing a partial basement and 3 stories. Stephen was methodical, completing each section, measuring and evaluating structural integrity, recording the state of the foundations, walls, floors, and beams. The basement level, which was only reachable by little stairs and partially below water level, was very difficult to inspect because of mold, water damage, and general degradation. At 2:30 p.m., Stephen was looking at He was in the basement storage corridor when he observed something strange about a portion of the wall. The structure had been built over several decades in stages with additions and changes created as the cannery grew. Sections differed in their construction, methods, and materials, but this specific wall didn't seem to be in line with everything in its immediate vicinity. The majority of the corridor walls were made of ancient brick and wood from the early 1900s when the cannery was built. However, this particular portion, it was made of wooden planking that looked to be from a different era and was about 12 feet wide. Depending on the materials and style, it could be from the 1920s or 1930s. The planks were worn, but clearly distinct from the old building around it. Stephen took a closer look at the wall. When the wooden planks were fastened vertically to a frame, what looked like a typical divider wall. However, there seemed to be a problem with it. The wall was a little thicker than what is required for a basic divider. The grain of wood and it appeared to have been built independently of the old structure based on weathering patterns. And most importantly, Stephen could hear that there was empty space behind the wall when he tapped on it at different times. Stephen examined the original architectural blueprints for the structure, which he had acquired from the Atoria Historical Society. This corridor was depicted in the blueprints. However, they suggested that the wall should have been built with original brick rather than wooden planking. The original plans did not include this wall. Since it was introduced later, there ought to be documentation of the modification. However, there are no construction records or modification permits for this existed in the archives of the city. Stephen measured and verified his suspicions. Behind this wall, there's around 10 to 12 feet of unaccounted area that should exist based on the building's footprint. However, it was inaccessible from any location. A secret chamber. Stephen presented the problem to his boss over the phone. Following their conversation, they chose to carefully to see what was behind it cut off a portion of the wooden planking. In the renovation of historic buildings, this was not uncommon. Buildings that had undergone decades of modification frequently featured forgotten parts, blocked-off chambers, and hidden places. In order to save as much of the structure as possible for historical documentation, a crowbar should be used. Stephen removed a few of the wooden planks that were vertical. There was a door frame behind them, and then a wooden door. From the corridor side, the door was closed and seemed to be locked or protected. Strong nails had been rammed into the door and through the door frame, sealing it closed. The doorknob was secured to the frame by a corroded chain. This was no chamber that had been overlooked. This space had been purposefully sealed. Someone had wanted to be certain that this door remained closed, keeping whatever was behind it concealed. Stephen took pictures of everything, including the shut door, the wall construction, and the problem as a whole. After that, he carefully cut off the nails and sliced through the corroded chain. After a significant amount of work, the door, swelling, was forced open due to rust and decades of humidity. Stephen flashed his spotlight into the shadows outside. The space measured roughly 10 by 12 feet, with a wooden partition wall on the fourth side and masonry walls on the other three. No windows were present. Only 7 feet high, the ceiling had exposed wooden beams. 2 walls of the space were covered in wooden shelf units, and rusted tin cans were piled high on those shelves. Cans of old salmon from the cannery's functioning days, their labels have long since faded or decayed to illegibility. And a human was seated in a wooden chair in the middle of the space, facing away from the door. Skeleton. The entire, fully articulated skeleton was sitting erect in the chair with a modest forward curvature of the spine, the head cocked downward as if the deceased was gazing at something on their lap when they passed away. In the lap were the skeletal hands, loosely entwined finger bones. The skeleton had degraded clothing on, cloth that was identifiable as a suit, but hung loosely on the bones. A coat was discernible under the jacket. The leg bones were hidden by pants. The ruined remnants of leather shoes were on the skeletal feet. A wooden clipboard with yellowed papers was on the floor close to the chair's legs. What was next to the clipboard seemed to be an early 20th century fountain pen. The handwritten and typewritten information on the documents on the clipboard was partially readable despite the age and degradation. Stephen left the room right away and dialed the Etoria Police Department. Detectives and police arrived around 4 o'clock p.m. By 5 o'clock p.m., forensic experts and the county medical examiner had shown up. The discovery had made local headlines the next morning. Human remains discovered in a closed compartment of a cannery building that had been abandoned for more than 50 years. Although the forensic investigation would take weeks, first findings presented an unsettling tale. There were indications of damage on the skeleton, a depression in the back of the head, and a blunt force hit. The room was sealed from the outside rather than the inside. The chain and nails were on the door's corridor side, and the documents on the clipboard looked to be a November inventory list. 1928. Additional research would discover the skeletons, identify and solve a riddle that had been kept a secret for 95 years in an abandoned cannery on the Oregon coast behind a false wall. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel and click that link before we proceed with this investigation. Alert bell. In November 1928, there was a successful entrepreneur. Labor disputes in the fishing sector in the Pacific Northwest and a disappearance that remained unsolved. You'll comprehend how a cannery works by the finish. Owner disappeared, and why it took 95 years to locate him. The inquiries investigators confronted were dismal and interesting. How did someone get sealed and dead? In a room used for storage? Who was motivated to conduct such a crime and had access to it? Moreover, is it possible to solve a 95-year-old murder case when all parties involved were long dead? In November 1928, Matthew James Smith was 52 years old, a self-made entrepreneur who has established one of the most prosperous salmon canneries. Over decades of diligent labor and astute business management on the Oregon coast, He was 5 feet 10 inches tall and had years of rigorous labor gave him a sturdy, stocky frame when he got both a manager and an owner. In his 40s, his hair had changed from brown to gray. By his 50s, he started turning white. He had a characteristic handlebar mustache, well-groomed, which was a source of pride. His hands displayed the calluses and scars from someone who had spent much of their time working with machinery and seafood. Of his existence, in 1876, Matthew was born in a tiny fishing community on the Scotland shore. He was raised on boats and was the son of fishermen. His father and older brothers taught him the fishing trade. In the late 1800s, Scotland's fishing sector was severe and gave the majority of families a low income. Ambitious and restless, Matthew made the decision. He desired more than Scotland could provide in his early 20s. In 1898, Matthew moved to the U.S. at the age of 22. He was aware of the Pacific Northwest has a thriving salmon fishing sector, with rivers teeming with fish during spawning season, and where canneries were being constructed to prepare and transport fish to markets both domestically and internationally. Matthew had little money when he arrived in Atoria, Oregon, but he knew a lot about fishing processing. The early years of Matthew's stay in America were challenging. He was employed as a worker in several canneries, processing fish for extended periods of time in chilly, damp circumstances for low pay. It was a hazardous and difficult job. Equipment could grab and twist arms and hands. Fish guts made the flooring slick. Blood. The stench was overpowering. However, Matthew became familiar with every facet of the enterprise: fish processing, canning methods, equipment upkeep, sales, labor management, and inventory management. Matthew gathered up enough cash by 1905 to take a stake in a small cannery operation. He had acquired his partners by 1912 and was the only owner of what Smith Salmon Cannery was his new name. The cannery expanded under his direction. Steadily, Matthew made improvements to his equipment and cultivated connections with captains of fishing boats who provided him with high-quality fish and established a reputation for producing premium-priced canned salmon. Matthew wed Ellen in 1902. O'Brien, the daughter of an Atoria boarding house run by an Irish immigrant family. Their union was robust and gave birth to 3 children. James was born in 1903. Margaret was born in 1909, while Robert was born in 1906. All 3 of the children had grown up by 1928. James was Matthew's employee at the cannery, assistant and future heir. Robert relocated to Portland in order to work in. Margaret was married and resided in Seattle, and she worked in finance. Smith Salmon Cannery was established in the 1920s, one of Atoria's bigger businesses with about 200 employees. Amid the busiest time of year, the cannery was housed in a large structure supported by pilings spanning the Columbia River with offices, storage spaces, processing facilities, and docking area where fishing vessels can deliver their catches. In the months of May through October, when salmon is in season, the cannery processed thousands of pounds of fish while running nonstop. Tens of thousands of cans were produced every day and transported by train to markets all around the nation. Matthew was regarded as a fair but strict employer. He maintained comparatively safe working conditions in comparison to certain competitors and paid fair compensation for the time. However, he also demanded diligence and self-control. Slacking was not tolerated by him. Theft or disobedience, opportunities and stable employment were given to employees who did well. For progress, employees who caused issues were let go. Those who were aware. He was described by Matthew as driven, serious, and focused. He was present at the cannery most days from sunrise to sunset, overseeing activities, checking accounts, and bargaining with vendors and purchasers. Despite his accomplishments, he led a simple life. The house of his family was cozy without being pretentious. He put his earnings back into the cannery. Instead of making extravagant purchases, he frequently went to church with Ellen, gave to charity in the area, and was respected in the business community of Atoria. However, 1928 was a difficult year. year for both Matthew and the fishing sector in the Pacific Northwest as a whole. Tension and difficulty were caused by a number of things. Populations of fish were displaying symptoms of deterioration following decades of heavy cropping. Competition was intense among canneries, which resulted in lower prices and, most importantly, labor. The industry was experiencing a rise in unrest. Workers on fishing boats and in canneries were starting to band together and call for improved pay and working conditions. The number of labor unions was rising. More powerful, work stoppages and strikes were become increasingly frequent. In few cases, labor disagreements have escalated into violent altercations between employees and firm security guards or local law enforcement. Smith Salmon Cannery employees decided in June 1928 to participate in a area cannery workers union and made demands for reduced working hours and increased pay to Matthew. The majority of the demands were rejected by Matthew, who claimed that the company's profit margins did not justify the higher expenses. Over the summer, tensions increased. In August, about 60 employees mounted a short strike, refusing to work for 3 days until Matthew consented to little pay raises. On both sides, the strike caused animosity. Matthew thought that employees had betrayed him. He has worked for several years. Some employees thought Matthew was acting irrationally and avaricious, refusing to give the workers who actually performed the work a piece of the cannery's prosperity. Mutual trust between management and employees declined. Many of the organizers of the ID strike were let go in the weeks after the settlement, which infuriated the surviving employees even more. By November of 1928, the salmon season was over, and the majority of the cannery's seasonal employees were let go until the next spring. Standard procedure. There was only a skeleton workforce of perhaps 20 permanent employees left, handling upkeep, stock, and getting ready for the upcoming season. The Cannery. The building was largely silent, which contrasted sharply with the busy summertime activities. For the first several days of November, Matthew, assessing the season's financial results, performing year-end inventory, and preparing for 1929. Despite the labor, the season had been monetarily successful to a moderate extent. Challenges. Although not as much, the cannery had processed and sold enough fish to turn profit, as big as in prior years. Matthew was cautiously hopeful about what was ahead. Year. November 3rd, 1928, a Friday. During supper, Matthew informed Ellen that he had to go to the cannery that night to finish some inventory work in the storage spaces. This was not out of the ordinary. Matthew frequently worked in the evenings, particularly at times of inventory. He dressed in a suit instead of casual attire. Even when working on inventory, Matthew always wore formal attire to uphold the decorum he believed was proper for an manager and proprietor. At 7:00 p.m., he left his house, promising to come back to Ellen. By 1:00 p.m., Ellen Smith didn't see her again after that. Husband is still alive. That was the last time anyone acknowledged seeing Matthew Smith. The following morning, the owner of the dog who had constructed a profitable company that had been in operation for more than 30 years had mysteriously disappeared. November 3rd, 1928. Atoria, Oregon, on a Friday night. The day's weather had been normal for the Oregon coast in early November. It's cool, cloudy, and occasionally rainy. In the afternoon, the temperature peaked at 52 degrees Fahrenheit before falling to the mid-40s by nightfall. Throughout the day, there was light rain. The kind of autumn and winter in the Pacific Northwest are often marked by steady drizzle. The fog was. As darkness fell, it started to build over the Columbia River, limiting visibility to a few hundred yards. As he had done on most days, Matthew Smith spent the majority of Friday at the cannery. Week. After the salmon season finished and the majority of employees were let go, the building was silent. The permanent staff was engaged in cleaning, maintenance, and fixing equipment so it can be stored during the winter. Matthew reviewed in his office all day inventory reports and financial records. Later, Ellen Smith remembered that Matthew had appeared normal but distracted throughout Friday night's meal. He would stated that he needed to finish verifying the inventory in a few storage rooms. The cannery had several storage spaces holding raw supplies, canned salmon ready to be sent, and apparatus. Precise inventory was essential for both financial accounting and organizing the operations for the upcoming season. At approximately 6:45 p.m., Matthew switched from the casual attire he had worn at home into a suit. He put on a jacket, tie, and vest. Even when performing jobs like inventory, he donned formal business clothing. Didn't need to be that formal. He had on a chain his gold pocket watch, affixed to his vest, as he did each day. He had on his wedding band. He placed his keys in the pocket of his pants and his wallet in the inside pocket of his jacket. Ellen was informed by Matthew that he was heading to the cannery to do the inventory check in one of the storage rooms located in the basement. He was promised to return by 1:00 p.m., maybe earlier. He bid her farewell with a kiss and walked away. The house on foot. Matthew found it easy to walk from the Smith family's house to the cannery, which was just 10 streets away. Often, Matthew would have needed to walk from the Smith residence to the cannery, roughly 15 to 20 minutes. The path was well known along the streets he'd walked for many years. The mild rain persisted, and Matthew probably had on a coat over his suit, though Ellen couldn't remember for sure if he had worn one that night. The Thomas O'Sullivan, Cannery's night watchman, was on duty every night to deter theft and damage. Thomas later reported to the police that he had shown up for work at 8 p.m. as planned. He had strolled through the building as he always did, making sure everything was safe. He had not seen a sign that someone was inside the structure. Every door was secured, as they should have been. In places where lights shouldn't be, none were on. Thomas took up residence in he spent the night, as he always did, in the watchman's office beside the main door. Thomas made it clear that he hadn't noticed Matthew's arrival that night. Matthew would have shown up between 7 and 7:30 p.m. based on when he departed from the house. Had he arrived prior to Thomas starting his shift at 8 p.m., Matthew would have spent between 30 and 60 minutes in the building prior to the arrival of the watchman. If Matthew showed up after 8 p.m., Thomas should have heard or seen him, but Thomas maintained that he hadn't. Ellen Smith anticipated that Matthew would be home by 1:00 p.m. By 10:30 p.m., he still hadn't come back. She started to feel a little worried, but not frightened. At times, Matthew became engrossed at work and stayed longer than anticipated. She became more concerned around 11 p.m. At midnight, when Matthew had yet to return and had not communicated, Ellen was deeply worried. The majority of residences in 1928 lacked telephones. The Smith household had a phone because it was necessary for Matthew's business, but many others did not. This made it challenging to swiftly find out where someone was. Ellen was unable to just call the cannery to see if Matthew was present. In the office, the cannery had a phone, but the night from other parts of the structure, the watchman might not hear it ringing. Approximately 12:30 a.m. on November 6th. 4th, in order to see how his father was doing, Ellen sent James, her eldest son, to the cannery. 25-year-old James, who knew the cannery where he worked, strolled the waterfront is 10 streets away on a misty, rainy night. James reached the cannery at approximately 12:45 a.m. and rapped on the door. "O'Sullivan Thomas, the watchman responded. James clarified that he was searching for his father, who had arrived at 7 p.m. to the cannery to perform inventory tasks. Thomas claimed to have observed no one all evening, that when he had come for his shift at 8 p.m., the building had, as far as he knew, been vacant. James and Thomas conducted a joint search of the cannery. They looked into Matthew's empty office. It was dark, and there was no indication that anyone had been there that night. They examined the processing areas, the equipment rooms, and the docking area were all deserted. They even examined the storage spaces, but just on the surface. There were multiple storage chambers in the cannery that held canned foods, various supplies, and it would have taken hours to thoroughly inspect them all. They found Matthew nowhere to be found. There was no indication that anyone had entered the building prior to Thomas that evening. Showed up for his shift. As it should have been, every door was locked from the inside. Nothing showed up, disturbing or inappropriate. About 1:30 a.m., James came home and informed his mother that Matthew didn't seem to have been at the cannery that night. Ellen and James was anxious and perplexed for the remainder of the night. Matthew, where were you? Had he visited where had he gone? Cannery, as he had mentioned. Had something occurred to him on in what way? November 4th, Saturday morning, was cloudy and overcast. Matthew hadn't. Went back to the house. James and Ellen headed to the Etoria Police Department to file a report. He's gone. After receiving the report, the responding officer recommended that Matthew may have left without telling his family and gone somewhere unexpected. Maybe he had come to Portland for work. Maybe he had gone to see how one of his fishing boat suppliers was doing. He was an adult who was free to come and go as he wanted, but Ellen maintained that this was totally inconsistent with his personality. Matthew never left the house, all night long without being informed. When he promised to return home, he always did. There was a problem. By Sunday, the police inquiry started on November 5th, when Matthew was still unaccounted for. Sincerely, and it would just reveal riddles and questions. The Detective William Harrison of the Etoria Police oversaw the inquiry into Matthew Smith's disappearance. Department. Harrison was a seasoned detective who had worked with the agency and has looked into a number of issues pertaining to the fishing sector, the waterfront, and the rough. Those who lived in that planet. Harrison's original hypothesis was simple. Matthew had either met with a mishap, either plunging into the river while traveling to or from the cannery, or he had experienced foul play, perhaps as a result of the labor disputes at his cannery. The investigator started by carefully examining both options. The first step in the search for Matthew was the path from his house to the cannery. The streets were patrolled by police officers. Matthew would have searched for any evidence of a struggle, any sign of an accident, anything that could account for his disappearance. Nothing was discovered. The light downpour, tracks, and evidence would have been lost on Friday night. But if violence had took place in the street, nothing was present. The coastline along the Columbia River was thoroughly examined. Had Matthew's body fallen into the river, it should have been stuck on pilings or debris or washed ashore someplace along the shore. The river in the vicinity of the cannery was dredged. There was nothing discovered. Bodies that entered Columbia, they usually came to the surface in a matter of days or were trapped in places where trash gathered, but nobody showed up. The actual cannery building was examined in great detail. James Smith, who was familiar with the building, followed the police as they examined every room, every storage space, every aspect of the building. They searched for indications of violence, for unseen corpses, for any clue as to what may have occurred. Nothing seemed out of place to them. The cannery was spotless and well-organized, just as the majority of the employees should have left at the end of the season. Everyone was interviewed by Detective Harrison, related to both Matthew's personal and professional lives. Ellen Smith supplied information regarding Matthew's daily routine, habits, and mental state in recent days. She said that Matthew had appeared normal, just a little anxious about business-related, but not exceptionally so. He had not indicated that he was preparing to depart or that he had a particular fear. James Smith, who collaborated closely with despite the summer's labor issues, the father at the cannery verified that business was fairly well. The cannery was profitable, according to literature. There was no sign of unreported debts or monetary issues that could have led Matthew to willingly vanish. The night watchman, Thomas O'Sullivan, was thoroughly interviewed. His narrative didn't change. He had come for his shift at 8 p.m. I checked the building on Friday night, and it was secure and vacant. I didn't see anyone that evening, until James Smith showed up in search of his father around midnight. Thomas didn't. Justification for Matthew's possible entry into the building and inventory. Work and vanish from sight. Unless Matthew showed up before 8 o'clock p.m., completed his task fast, and departed before Thomas got there. However, that refuted Matthew's claim to Ellen that he would stay until around 10 o'clock at night. The about 20 permanent interviews were conducted with all of the cannery's remaining employees. On Friday night, the majority had been off duty. The few who had left by 6 p.m. after working earlier in the day. Nobody claimed to have seen Matthew on Friday night at the cannery. Nothing out of the ordinary was noted. Investigator Harrison looked into the cannery's labor disputes. Following the August strike, the employees who had been let go were located and conducted an interview. For Friday night, a number of them had obvious alibis. More investigation was done on those without strong alibis. There was no proof linking any of them to Matthew vanished. Interviews were conducted with union organizers who had participated in the summer strike. A few had persisting hostility against Matthew, seeing him as a tyrannical boss who had prevented them from assembling, but hostility did not prove murder. Once more, nobody had reliable information regarding Matthew's Friday whereabouts. Evening investigations were also conducted into rival cannery owners. The canning of salmon. The corporate world was fiercely competitive. Fish supply were contested by canneries for clients, for employees. Both personal and professional rivalries existed. However, getting rid of even in such harsh corporate environment, competing by murder seems extreme. There was no proof that any rival was involved in Matthew's disappearance. The notion that Matthew had orchestrated his own disappearance was investigated by Detective Harrison. Maybe his family was unaware of his bills or issues. Maybe he had a mistress and had fled with her. Maybe he wanted to start over somewhere else. However, an examination of Matthew's finances revealed no unexpected or concealed indebtedness. Transactions. There was no sign of romantic involvement. Matthew's financial accounts were left intact. The hypothesis was not validated. As weeks passed, the investigation came to a standstill. No witnesses were present. No one was there. There was no tangible proof. There was no obvious motivation that indicated a particular suspicious. Matthew Smith had just disappeared, leaving a bewildered family, an inexplicable absence, and unanswered questions. 1 month following the disappearance, in early December 1928, Detective Harrison was forced to acknowledge that the investigation was unresolved and unlikely to be resolved. Without fresh data, officially, the probe was still open, but it was idle. The police report on Matthew Smith was kept in the archives of the department, one of the numerous unresolved instances that plagued investigators who were unable to solve the problem. Ellen Smith resided with her kids. Unpleasant uncertainty. Had Matthew passed away? Was he still alive somewhere? Unwilling or unable to return? To come back? In many respects, it was worse to not know than to know the worst. Ellen, she was still legally married. Thus, she was unable to get married again. She lacked proof. Therefore, she was unable to grieve completely. Of passing away, she was in a state of uncertainty. In 1932, for years after Matthew vanished, Ellen asked the judge to have her legally proclaimed dead. The length of the petition led the court to grant it. Of time he had been absent, and the assumption that, if he were still alive, he would have gotten in touch with his family. Matthew. On November 3, 1928, James Smith was formally pronounced dead. The declaration made it possible for Ellen and her family to proceed both financially and legally. However, it didn't explain what had truly occurred. Ellen Smith passed away 19 years after her husband's disappearance. In 1947, at the age of 71, she never discovering the truth. She was laid to rest in the spacious Ocean View Cemetery in Etoria, set aside for Matthew close to her tomb, but it was still unoccupied. James. The cannery was taken over by Smith, who managed it until the early 1950s when he sold it to a bigger business. Before finally closing it, the new owners ran it for an additional 20 years. The early 1970s, when the salmon business in the Pacific Northwest finally fell as a result of economic and environmental factors. The structure sat 50 years of abandonment. It was owned at different times by different individuals and businesses. However, nobody made any investments in its upkeep or redevelopment. It gradually declined, turning into a coastal icon that serves as a reminder of the time when Etoria had been a significant hub for canning and fishing. Additionally, within that structure in A, Matthew Smith sat in a wooden chair in a storage area that was hidden behind a false wall. Encircled by corroded cans, they waited 95 years to be found. The 95 years between the November 1928 disappearance of Matthew Smith and the identification of his, as of September 2023, Etoria and the Pacific Northwest. The fishing business has undergone nearly complete transformation. The rising canning of salmon. Early 20th century Etoria's economy was characterized by this industry, progressively decreased until completely vanishing. The decrease had several reasons. Early in the 20th century, overfishing caused salmon to decline. Populations in rivers in the Pacific Northwest. Building dams on the Columbia. Salmon migration pathways were interrupted by rivers and other waterways, making it impossible for fish to arriving at spawning grounds. Degradation of pollution due to industrial development. Water quality. The labor-intensive canning technique became less necessary as economics changed. Profitable. The majority of the canneries that formerly bordered Etoria's, the waterfront was permanently closed. The Smith Salmon Cannery was run by. Before closing in the early 1970s, it had several owners during the 1950s and 1960s. The building remained empty after it was closed. The property was transferred multiple times, with several owners thinking about redevelopment but never carrying it out. The structure gradually deteriorated due to weather exposure, neglect, and sporadic vandalism. The widow of Matthews, Ellen Smith, never discovered her husband's fate. Following Matthew's abduction, she opened a small boarding home, earning money for herself and assisting in her children's early adulthood. She continued to believe that instead of leaving his family behind, Matthew had encountered foul play, but she lacked both evidence and solutions. In 1947, she passed away. Unresolved, the mystery died with her. James Smith, who had collaborated closely with his father and had looked for him the night he vanished, successfully navigated the cannery via the difficult years following World War II and the Great Depression. However, he was always curious about what had occurred on the November evening in 1928. Even as he grew older in the 1970s and in the 1980s, James would sometimes conjecture with relatives on his father's destiny. Had he fled, been murdered, or drowned? At the age of 85, James passed away in 1988 without receiving any answers. Over the years, the Smith family scattered throughout the United States. Robert, Matthew's second son, continued to work in banking in Portland, where he raised a family and ultimately retiring there. Matthew's daughter Margaret resided in her family in Seattle. Their offspring relocated to different locations and led typical lives with just a remote ties to the family's canine past and Etoria. By the beginning of the 21st century, very few Puerto Ricans could recall the loss of Smith, Matthew, 1928. Ancient history was eclipsed by all that had occurred in the more than 90 years that had passed. The Great Depression, global, the American economy's evolution following World War II, the ascent and decline of businesses, the historic Cannery buildings that still stood, oddities, remnants of a time in economic history that younger generations were only familiar with. Books and old photos. The Smith Salmon Cannery structure turned into a small element of Etoria's historical landscape. Periodically, local historical articles. It was noted in media as one of the few cannery buildings from the city's heyday of fishing. Periodically, plans to demolish it and redevelop the waterfront property emerged, but they never made any headway sufficient to cause action. The inside of the building retained mostly unaltered over the years. Occasionally, vandals entered through broken doors or windows, but the interior gave little benefit to steel and was largely empty. The procedure. Equipment was taken out decades ago. All that was left were vacant rooms. deteriorating brick walls, rotting hardwood floors, and the stench of decades of neglect, salt air, and mold. The level of the basement was especially deteriorated, partly below the Columbia River's high water line. It experienced flooding on occasion during storm surges and high seas. Water damage was vast. It was visible on wooden beams. The walls made of bricks were falling apart. The ground was frequently drenched or standing in puddles. The majority of those who examined the structure. The basement was only briefly examined over the years. Clearly, it was the most damaged area and didn't seem to have any salvaging worth. Within the passageway where, in 2023, Stephen Clark would find the secret room. For 9.5 decades, the fake wooden wall remained unaltered. The wall had been built with such care that it seemed to be an original or at least long-standing component of the structure of the building. In the absence of comprehensive architectural designs for comparison, there was no clear sign that it hidden anything. It was merely a wall in an abandoned underground hallway, building that was rarely used. In the enclosed storage area beyond that wall, the remains of Matthew Smith remained undisturbed in the room. The space was closed off from the outer world, and the environment was comparatively steady due to the rain. Although not as durable as full ceiling, the higher basement level's dry conditions and the absence of air circulation shielded the remains from the quick deterioration that would have happened in a damp or exposed environment. The space itself turned into a time capsule. Over time, the canned salmon on the shelves decayed, the contents long gone ruined, the tin cans rotting. However, the cans from the 1920s were still on the edge shelves. The clipboard containing the inventory list was still on the ground after it had been dropped or fallen. The fountain pen stayed next to it, and in the wooden chair in the middle of the room, Matthew Smith's skeleton stayed where it was when he passed away, waiting for someone to crack open the door, and tell the truth. Atoria's economy had changed by 2023, from tourism, the arts, and service sectors to manufacturing and fishing. Once home to operational canneries and fish processing facilities, the city's historic shoreline was undergoing reconstruction, featuring shops, eateries, breweries, and homes. Historical, economic growth and preservation were balanced as the city tried to preserve its identity while adjusting to contemporary economic conditions. Pacific Coast Development LLC, a business in July 2023, specializes in adaptive reuse and historic building rehabilitation, bought the $1.3 million Old Smith Salmon Cannery property. The business had an ambitious plan: transform the dilapidated industrial structure into about 40 opulent seaside condos while maintaining some interior elements and the building's antique exterior. Before renovations could start, the project needed a thorough structural examination. Development of the Pacific Coast selected Portland-based Harrison Engineering, a company with expertise in historic building repair, to carry out thorough structural examination. Senior structural engineer Stephen Clark has. Harrison Engineering was given the task of overseeing the evaluation. Stephen started his inspection in August 2023, carefully going over each area of the constructing over a few weeks. Structurally, the upper floors were in rather decent shape. However, they needed substantial cosmetic makeover. There was little damage on the main floor, although was salvageable. The most troublesome level was the basement, which had considerable decay, water damage, and structural issues that would necessitate substantial corrective action. September 17, 2023. Stephen was looking through the storage corridors on the basement level. These little passages linked different storage spaces where materials and canned goods had been stored throughout the years that the cannery was in operation. Many of the rooms were now empty, with nothing in them. When the Cannery closed decades ago, it was removed. Stephen was measuring, with photos, recording the state of the floors, walls, and ceilings. He was working on an east side corridor at 2:30 p.m. of the basement when he saw the unusual wall part previously mentioned. Following the discovery that there was After getting his supervisor's approval to explore the secret area behind the wall, Stephen started cautiously, removing portions of the wooden planks that are vertical. Although the wood was old, not especially rotten, the upper level of the basement was above the flood zone and comparatively dry. Stephen carefully removed the planks from their supporting frame with a crowbar. Reduce harm. More of what was behind became visible as each board separated. Visible. Heavy nails were driven into a wooden door, a door frame, and the door handle was encircled by a corroded chain. Stephen took pictures of everything thoroughly before moving forward. The heads of the old nails were rusted, but still sturdy. The chain had been made of sturdy steel, but it was severely corroded. First, both showed that the door had been purposefully sealed shut and had stayed like way for several decades. One by one, Stephen took out the nails, used his crowbar's claw end. Every nail fought, holding onto the ancient wood, firmly, but finally gave in. Bolt cutters were used to cut the chain. After removing all the physical obstacles, Stephen finally reached for the doorknob and tugged. The door was jammed and swelled. Stephen tugged more forcefully, bracing. With a shattering sound, he pressed himself up against the door frame. Wood. Into darkness, the door opened inward. The odor that surfaced was stale and musty, the smell of air that has been closed up for many years. Stephen used his flashlight to illuminate the space. A room about 10 feet broad and 12 feet deep was lit by the beam. 3 sides are made of brick, while 2 walls are packed with wooden shelving units, with tin cans that have rusted. Additionally, in the middle of the space, about 6 feet from the door, a human skeleton seated in a wooden chair. The skeleton was full and well-spoken, sitting up on the chair with exceptional conservation. The skeleton has a slumped posture due to the modest forward curvature of the spine. As though staring at something in the lap, the cranium was cocked downward. With the hands lying in the lap area, the skeletal arms hung at the sides. Bones arranged loosely, giving the impression that the hands were folded or clasped when someone passed away. Deteriorated fabric hung on the aid, and the skeleton was dressed. Despite their age, bones, a jacket, vest, shirt, and pants are all clearly evident. And degradation. Although the fabric was frail and discolored, it still had sufficient structure to be recognizable. The remnants of leather shoes were on the feet. The leather cracked and dried, but identifiable. There seemed to be a chain or cord hanging around the skeleton's neck, probably for a pocket timepiece. The silhouette of a tiny object in the vest pocket was visible, most likely the watch itself, remaining in the pocket where it had been positioned 95 years prior. On the 4th finger of the left hand, a ring was. A plain band, probably a wedding ring, is visible. The floor close to the chairs. Legs, Stephen's flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing a wooden clipboard with what seemed like documents that are attached. There was a fountain pen next to the clipboard, the kind with the gold nib that was prevalent in the early 1900s. The documents on the clipboard revealed handwriting and written material, but Stephen couldn't see it from the doorway. Go over the specifics. 2 walls worth of wooden shelving units were piled with cans of tin. The labels on the cans were generally missing or deteriorated, and they were severely corroded. Illegibility, although the dimensions and form matched those of early 20th century salmon cans. The cans were still there, the shelves in neat rows, indicating that they had been placed there on purpose and had stayed unaltered ever since. Stephen left the room right away and dialed 911. He subsequently reported the finding to his supervisor at Harrison Engineering over the phone. By 3:00 p.m. police in Etoria. Officers from the department were present. By 4:00 p.m., crime scene investigators and detectives. Investigators had shown up. By 5 p.m., the county physician had been informed and en route. The area was considered a possible crime scene, in spite of its age. Before anyone went past the entryway and inside the chamber, extensive photography captured everything from every viewpoint. The entrance, the walls hiding it, the interior of the room, the location of the skeleton, The shelf, cans, clipboard, and pen were all meticulously photographed. The next day, on September 18th, forensic experts wearing protective gear cautiously entered the chamber to carry out a thorough analysis. High-resolution cameras captured images of the skeleton from all sides. Measurements were made. Every bone's location was previously recorded. Everything was relocated. There were obvious traces of trauma on the skeleton. The back of the head, and a portion of the skull displayed a depressed fracture with a diameter of about 2 inches. The bone was forced inside, resulting in a concave indentation with fracture lines radiating outward from the impact site. This was in line with blunt force trauma caused by a heavy item hitting the back of the skull. The location and intensity of the trauma implied a strong strike that would have instantly rendered the victim unconscious or killed them. The rear of the head showed that the person had been hit from behind, probably without warning or the chance to protect themselves. The space itself conveyed a narrative. The door had been closed off from the outside. The chain and nails were on the side of the hallway, not the side of the room. This implied that the person who secured the room did so after the individual was inside, either dying or dead. The fake wall built to conceal the door had been constructed to provide an extra degree of camouflage above the sealed entrance. The papers on the floor and a clipboard were meticulously gathered and inspected. The documents included an inventory sheet, pre-printed forms containing columns for locations, quantities, and item descriptions. The forms were completed by hand using fountain pen ink that had become brown but was still readable in numerous locations. The inventory noted the date and batch number of the canned salmon, amounts, and places of storage. Most importantly, at the top of the date on the inventory page was November 3rd, 1928. Additionally, there was a partially visible signature at the bottom that looked to be M. Smith. Investigators gently removed a gold coin from the skeleton's waistcoat pocket. Pocket timepiece. The watch's mechanism was rusted and it had stopped, either AM at 8:47 or PM, which is impossible to ascertain. The rear of the watch had an engraving on the case, MJS 1910. Inside the inner pocket of the jacket, investigators discovered an intact, dry, and brittle leather wallet. Within, there were multiple items in the wallet. Matthew James Smith received a driver's license from the state of Oregon within. The address in Etoria is good until December 1929. M.J. Smith, the proprietor of Smith Salmon Cannery, is identified on multiple business cards. Oregon's Etoria. About $40 in cash, darker notes with age, but they were still identifiable as authentic 1920s U.S. banknotes. The wedding band on the. After thorough cleaning, the inscription on the inside of the skeleton's left hand, which was made of plain gold, became visible. M. and E 1902. This evidence all led to one conclusion. The skeleton was Smith, Matthew James, the owner of Cannery, who vanished on November 3rd, 1928, 95 years ago, and he had remained in this storage area the whole time. Room, only a few feet from locations that police had checked in 1928 and by several individuals during the ensuing decades. The remains of Matthew Smith were found 95 years after his. Detectives from the Etoria Police Department began looking into the disappearance right away, along with historians, forensic experts, and Smith family descendants. Both historical research and forensic investigation would be necessary to comprehend what had occurred. The forensic, examining the skeletal remains revealed unambiguous information about Matthew's cause of death. The fracture's depression on the back of the head was consistent with a single, strong hit from a blunt. Something like a pipe, a wrench, a heavy tool, or something like adipose. Such a fracture would have needed a significant amount of force, indicating the assailant was either extremely powerful or had used a lot of force when swinging the weapon. The injury's location, the back of the skull, suggesting that Matthew had been hit from behind. Most likely, he never saw his assailant or had a chance to protect himself. The blow would have caused a catastrophic brain damage that resulted in instant unconsciousness and probably death within minutes, even if doctors. There had been assistance, but it wasn't. The skeleton's location in the chair implied that Matthew had either been seated when he was struck or had been put in the chair thereafter, somewhere else in the space. The floor-mounted clipboard with a dated inventory sheet. On November 3rd, 1928, it appeared that Matthew was working on inventory when he was assaulted. With his back to the door, he might have been writing on the clipboard while seated in the chair while he was hit from behind by someone who came into the room. Despite Dean forensic examination also verified that blunt force trauma to the head was the cause of death. Even after 95 years, the skeletal evidence was unmistakable. There had been a murder of Matthew Smith. Important evidence was found in the room itself. Regarding the offense, nails and chain had been used to shut the door from the outside. The fictitious wall had been designed to totally conceal the door. Both demonstrated premeditation and preparing. This was not an impulsive deed followed by a desperate attempt to hide. This was murder followed by the body's deliberate disposal. Historical context regarding the false wall was provided by study, construction data, and building permits for the Smith, the Etoria Historical Society, and the city's archives of Salmon Cannery. Department of Construction. A permit for interior changes issued in December 1928 was discovered through inquiry. And cannery repairs. James Smith had been granted the permit. After his father vanished, Matthew's son assumed control of the cannery. The authorization didn't say precisely what changes were being made. It was an all-purpose maintenance and repair job, but the time was crucial. December of 1928, only a month following Matthew's disappearance. The artificial wall must have been built at this time in order to. The sealed storage compartment should be permanently hidden. This brought up an unsettling idea. If James Smith had been aware that his father's body was trapped in that chamber, engaged in the murder or the cover-up, or had someone tricked him, genuinely carried out the crime? Additional research about James Smith's past indicated that he most likely had no direct involvement in the actual murder. James had been the one who looked for Matthew on the night he vanished. James had given the cops his complete cooperation. Inquiry. James had managed the cannery for many years without ever displaying any signs of shame or peculiar actions in relation to his father's disappearance. However, James could have been forced or coerced into building the phony wall by the real murderer, without knowing why. The most likely account of what happened based on. This was based on the historical background and facts that was available. November 3rd, 1928. Around 7 p.m., Matthew Smith visited the cannery to carry out inventory task, as he had instructed his spouse. He visited to check the inventory of canned goods, used the basement storage area. With his clipboard in hand, he sat on the wooden chair and wrote down batch numbers and quantities. That night, there was another person in the cannery, either someone who entered after Matthew did, or someone who had concealed himself there prior to Matthew's arrival. This individual waited for Matthew to be working on his inventory, then came up behind him and hit him in the back of the head with a bulky item. Matthew passed away rapidly, possibly in a matter of minutes. The murderer then had to decide how to get rid of the body. Just leaving it to be discovered would instantly result in a probe into murder. Hiding it somewhere else put it at risk of being found. The body was sealed within the storage room, and the door was nailed shut. Close the door and hide the whole space behind a fake wall to make it look to be only an additional segment of the hallway wall. In the days or weeks that followed, the murderer most certainly came back to build the fake wall. Alternatively, the murderer persuaded another person, possibly James Smith, that the wall has to be constructed for justifiable purposes in order to unintentionally hide the crime. Because of the skilled construction, it was not immediately apparent to a casual observer that the wall concealed anything. Matthew Smith was killed by whom? Following 95 years, with all parties involved long dead, determination of the precise. It was impossible to be a killer. However, a number of questionable categories were conceivable given the historical setting. an unhappy employee or ex-employee who has a complaint against Matthew. The 1928 labor disputes had led to true hostility. Someone who felt mistreated or had been fired might have wanted retribution. Such an individual would have been aware of the Cannery layout, the anticipated location of Matthew's inventory work, and had motivation. A competing dog owner or agent. The canning of salmon. The corporate world was fiercely competitive. Rivals would gain from eliminating a successful competitor, but this appeared less probable. Competitors in the business world may destroy machinery or propagate falsehoods, but even in that harsh sector, murder was a serious crime. A burglar or a thief. Maybe that evening, someone broke into the cannery with the intention of stealing equipment or canned food. Matthew took them by surprise, and, to prevent being identified, they killed him. However, this did not clarify the complex. The subsequent cover-up, which implied preparation rather than panic. The most likely scenario was a union, a sacked employee, or someone with a personal grudge. Organizer who held Matthew accountable for putting an end to the strike. Someone who believed they were wronged by Matthew. This individual was familiar with the body. Cannery meticulously organized the attack because he was aware of Matthew's habits. They locked the chamber after killing Matthew and then built the artificial wall to make sure the crime would never be found. The idea was successful for 95 years. The space stayed closed and concealed. The mystery surrounding Matthew's disappearance remained unanswered. The murderer survived. They took their secret to the grave decades ago and lived their lives without being discovered. The September 2023 finding eventually gave the descendants of the Smith family their answers. Genealogical. Thomas Harrison, 43, was found to be Matthew's great-great-grandson, residing in Seattle. Although Thomas was aware of his ancestors' unexplained disappearance in 1928, he lacked any sentimental ties to a person who passed away almost a century before he was born. DNA. Thomas's samples and the verified skeletal remains were compared. Family ties that are continuous from great-great-grandson to great-great-grandfather, although DNA deterioration over a 95-year period made complete confirmation is not feasible. The combination of DNA proof, the historical background, and identifying records discovered with the remains offered enough assurance that the Matthew James Smith was the skeleton. The remains of Matthew were given to the family in October of 2023. October 28th, 95 years and 6 days ago. Matthew James Smith was laid to rest in Ocean View Cemetery following his murder in Atoria in the plot beside his spouse, Ellen, where room had been set aside for. Since 1947, when she passed away, after 9.5 decades divided by, they were back together, surrounded by sealed walls and mystery. The gravestone that was built because Matthew accepted both his life and the peculiar circumstances surrounding his demise. After 95 years, Matthew James Smith, 1876 to 1928, was at last able to return home. The renovations to the historic Smith Salmon Cannery buildings continued, although with notable changes to the initial strategy. Matthew's remains were discovered in a storage room that was, instead of being turned into a residential area, it was kept as a historical memorial. The History, Pacific Coast Development, and the Historical Society collaborated to establish a small museum area that documents the Matthew Smith and the salmon canning industry. Mystery. For 95 years, the room had been hidden behind a false wall, largely conserved, and is currently on exhibit with signs explaining how. The room was concealed, and the revelation made it clear. The actual space can be seen through a glass barrier for protection, preserved in its original state upon discovery, including a replica. Furnishings like the ones that were there when Stephen Clark opened the closed door. What actually transpired with? On November 3rd, 1928, Matthew Smith? Based on the evidence at hand, we are aware that he went to take inventory at his cannery. We are aware that he was hit from behind, murdering him with a blunt object. His body was sealed in a storage facility as we know, concealed behind a fake wall in a room. We are aware that he spent 95 years there, until his final resting site was inadvertently unearthed by contemporary repair work. What we are unable to know via. There is no doubt as to who killed him or why. Those specifics perished with. Everyone was involved decades ago. The most we can ascertain is that an individual with sufficient motivation, familiarity with Matthew's routines, and access to the Cannery killed him, carried out the murder, and managed to hide it for almost a century. The tale of Matthew Smith serves as a reminder that structures can conceal secrets for generations, that barriers might hide realities that everyone believes to be lost, everlasting, and that construction and remodeling can occasionally uncover mysteries that appear to be concealed forever. It serves as a reminder that justice, even when eventually served by merely discovering the truth, even if it is postponed by 95 years. 95 years later, sealed in, Matthew Smith has emerged from the shadows. At last, his family is aware. What took place? At last, his grave is filled. The owner of the Cannery who disappeared on a misty November night in 1928, who was seated in a storage area encircled by cans of salmon while the outside world continued on without him, has been discovered and buried. Eventually, the fake wall that was supposed to keep him hidden revealed its secret. Additionally, Oregon's coast revealed another of its hidden realities. Matthew James Smith, may you rest in peace. It's time to end your lengthy stay in that locked room. Your relatives are aware of what transpired, and you're finally with your wife, where you should have been all along. Ellen, in a tomb marked with your name and narrative.